Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the Daily Friend Show. I'm your host, Nicholas Lorimer, joined today by Marius. Marius, how are you doing?
How's Nick? How's it going?
Very good, thank you. It is, of course, very wet, cold, rainy, and not a lot of electricity to go around, but we make do. And I'm also joined by Mr. Michael Morris. Michael, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you. We've just had our 4 hours off this morning. I'm glad to say it's come back on. And unusually, for once, we're sunny and you're rainy. No rain here at the moment. Nice sunny day.
So it shows even the Republic of the Cape can't keep electricity going, eh?
Yeah.
Oh, what joy, what joy. And speaking of electricity, let's start our first story for today. This is a ruling, I think it came out on Friday last week. And this was much to the shock of I think a lot of commentators because it's such a crazy ruling. But anyway, the North Gauteng High Court in Pretoria has ruled that all hospitals, clinics, schools, and police stations should be spared from electricity disruptions. The judge, Norman Davis, said that Pravin Gordhan must take all reasonable steps within 60 days to ensure that public health establishments, state schools, and the South African Police Service are not affected by load shedding. This is after a case brought by a sort of whole collection of what we might call kind of opposition groups, mostly political parties, but also a union, that being the UDM, the IFP, Action SA, National Union of Metal Workers, and some other groups came together to say that basically important government functions must be exempt from load shedding. The ruling went on to say that if they can't be exempted from load shedding in the case of sort of schools or clinics or whatever, then the government must provide alternatives such as solar systems or generators or something like that to ensure the smooth operation of these government functions. But this creates a bit of a problem. As we know, state capacity is, shall we say, not fantastic. And so trusting the government to do a massive rollout of expensive generators to the entire country, never mind pay for all of the petrol and diesel that it would cost to run all those generators, seems fairly far-fetched. So then you're kind of left with the option of, well, I guess then they must not load shed these places. However, the way the electricity infrastructure is built in the vast majority of the country is it's almost impossible to isolate schools and police stations and that kind of thing. In effect, this would suspend an enormous number of places around the country from being load shed at all. And the reason we load shed in the first place is to prevent the collapse of our national electricity grid, because if the demand ever is higher than the supply, it can cause the whole grid to fail, which can knock the power out for weeks, if not even a month. So the spokesperson for the presidency said, we have very significant concerns about this judgment and its impact of the stability of the grid and the negative effects on the fiscus. In that regard, an appeal is very likely. So none of us are legal people. So as to the quality of the judgment, I don't think we can really say much. But Marius, what's your take on this? This seems like not a great place for government or the electricity grid to be in right now.
Yeah, and I just don't think it's a very feasible judgment. As we were just saying before the show, probably every grid block, or whatever you call it, has a police station, a school, and a clinic in it. I mean, I don't think it's feasible to exempt anywhere from load shedding. And I mean, it's fine if you want to give contingency plans, generators, or solar, and so on. I mean, just the cost of that. I mean, I don't know how much a generator is, but I mean, to run a big, facility like a school or whatever, or a hospital, I'm sure you need a pretty big generator. Or even if you want to use solar power. I know, a friend of mine just installed solar power to his house, and it cost him around about 150,000 Rand. And that was just for one house with 2 people living in it. So now if you want to have solar powers that are going to power, like, as I say, like a big facility, like a school or hospital, whatever the case is, it's probably going to cost you a lot more than that. So I just don't know where, number one, the government will get the money, and I just don't think it's feasible. But I think it's these kind of socioeconomic rights which are guaranteed in the Constitution, and which people did warn about when the constitutional negotiations were going on. There's just certain rights that you can't really guarantee, like that kind of thing. So I mean, as you said, we're not legal people, but it just doesn't seem like a very feasible ruling to make. And probably the best way to make sure nobody, that schools and police stations and so on have electricity, is make sure that the flipping grid is working properly and all the power stations are working properly. And best way to start looking at how to reform Eskom, if Eskom is even reformable. I'm not sure. I think that ship might have sailed, and I think reality might actually result in the privatization of Eskom or the breakup of Eskom, which I think the ANC is actually, I think they just don't want to admit it to themselves, but I think they know that's the only way we're actually going to get out of this crisis. But yeah, and who knows? I mean, we were on stage 6 over the weekend, which was not just a weekend. So who knows what's going to be like when things start really getting really cold in June and July in South Africa.
Now, if we had a more sort of decentralized, nimble, responsive, and better run distribution grid, maybe some of this might be even possible. If we had a number of distributors per, in a big city like Joburg, instead of just 2, the 2 we have in Joburg are City Power, which is owned by the city, and Eskom. And those organizations are not particularly flexible, responsive. And that means that, they're really not capable of doing the technical stuff needed to enact a ruling like this. In contrast to, for example, and it isn't a perfect example because, of course, it's a small municipality, but that municipality in the Northern Free State where they have the privatized distribution grid, and as a result, they've actually been able to make a plan, for example, to exclude the water pumping stations from being shut down during load shedding. For the rest of the country, that's not really an option because we're stuck with these giant monolithic, dysfunctional distribution providers in the form of either the city administrations or Eskom themselves. Michael, what do you make of this story?
I think, all these points are cogent and valid. As Marius is indicating, we have so many sort of nice to haves in a country that just can't afford them. We're all, it's something quite charming almost about South African society that we do have this kind-hearted default position that we want to do good things to people who are vulnerable and good things for them and so on. And there's no doubt schools and hospitals and police stations at Bush are key services, but the whole economy is actually a key service. That's really where the emphasis ought to lie, providing electricity reliably, cost effectively to the economy. That's really ought to be the key focus. And one of the big worries here would be the tenderpreneurs rubbing their hands with glee at the thought of all these new contracts that are going to come on stream now, so that the government can meet the obligations of this court order, and will have to spend money on generators and fuel and so on, precisely for the reasons that you mentioned, Nick. That it's just impossible to isolate all these state facilities. It isn't, as Marius says, a feasible route to go. It seems, given the paucity of our legal knowledge, but certainly from a practical point of view, it just doesn't look like anything like the kind of workable solution that the country needs.
So I'm sure it's going to be appealed and all that, but you were going to say something, Marius?
I was going to say, I think there's an anecdote worth repeating. Our boss, John Endres, he told us in a meeting this morning that he hasn't had electricity since Thursday afternoon. And apparently, and he lives in Johannesburg, and apparently city power technicians are running around with chickens with no heads because there's so many outages and faults in the city at the moment. So it's all quite concerning.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, definitely. And unfortunately, probably in terms of the health of the electricity grid and the fiscus, the best case scenario here is that the government does what it does quite often with a lot of these sort of socioeconomic rights court cases and makes a kind of half-hearted attempt or creates a process by which you can apply for a generator or something, but it's hopelessly choked with bureaucracy and inefficiency and nothing really changes. But that's not great either, because it means then that the court ruling is eroded, which I think is very not great in and of itself. Yeah. Marius, do you have any thoughts before we close up?
No, just this is obviously a massive crisis. Also, I spoke to a friend of mine over the weekend. His father-in-law runs a manufacturing firm, and the guy's panicking because he can basically get only about 4 hours production a day now, and that's obviously not really feasible. And I don't think for what he does, a generator isn't strong enough. He needs power off the grid. So it's all pretty worrying, and it's all these kind of knock-on effects. If he has to close down, how many people are going to lose jobs? Tax money he won't be paying because obviously he doesn't have any income. So it's all I think that's, this is probably one of the biggest crises facing South Africa. It's probably bigger since the end of apartheid.
Yeah.
And then to add to this, so we've now got this court ruling which Andre de Ruyter, when he was still the Eskom CEO, and also the government has suggested could push the country closer to a total grid collapse, because it means that there's more exemptions or more possible exemptions from the electricity grid. And just as that news comes out, the state-owned insurers, the SA Special Risk Insurance Association, has followed suit of the private sector and said that if there are riots or unrest or anything like that during a total grid collapse or an electricity grid collapse, even not a total one, even a sort of a more localized one, they will not be covering any insurance claims. And I think now that's, unless you are quite specialized or willing to pay an enormous premium, it's pretty difficult to get coverage in that circumstance. And so that means if we do hit something like a total grid collapse, the financial consequences for small businesses, I think in particular, but even just ordinary people whose homes might get broken into in the chaos of such an event, could be quite spectacular. Michael, any thoughts on that?
Very worrying, really, when an organization that you would have thought, think very carefully before it makes public statements about sort of potentially impending events. It appears to have thought about it and actually foresees it as a possibility. That it sends a chill wind through society, I think. A very worrying development. Yet you can understand how it's come about. That the potential costs and claims arising from things going completely pear-shaped would be just too costly to think about. So a very, very worrying development, I think.
Indeed. So I think it just highlights the fact that we must avoid such a circumstance as a whole. The insurer defines electricity grid failure, and so this is the things it won't cover as being the total or partial failure, interference with the interruption or suspension of any electricity supply in any manner from any source and for any reason which affects an entire or major part of any municipal area. And will not indemnify you if, in such a circumstance, will not indemnify you for any loss, damage, cost, or expense directly or indirectly caused by arising out of or in any way or to any extent contributed to by or in connection with electricity grid failure. So that's pretty comprehensive from the legal perspective, which is not comforting.
And also, sorry, just to bat in there, just looking at the Business Day story, just to put this into context, the July 2021 looting and unrest in KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng, it says, resulted in claims of about 32 billion against Sasria. And by mid-July last year, about a year on, it had paid about 24 billion in claims, with 6,800 claims outstanding, with a total value of 7 billion out of a total of 21,000. So that was a fairly, obviously very significant event, but fairly localized. If you extrapolate that to a kind of national picture, across all the capitals. You'd be looking at a very, very significant costs. They're saying they're not going to consider the claims, but obviously the costs are going to be enormous. Could be enormous potentially. So, yeah.
All right. With that in mind, sorry for anyone watching on video. My camera froze there for a second. Let's move on to a story that is worth keeping in mind about how, despite how bad some things are, we do still have quite a lot of things, I think, as South Africans to be proud of. In this case, this actually comes from the president. He said recently in his newsletter, I think, which came out today, that the country should be proud of its free media. I think last week was World Media Freedom Day, and there were rankings brought out by various institutions ranking all the countries in the world for how free their media is. And Ramaphosa noted this, saying that we've improved significantly in our ranking on the World Press Freedom Index. He said, quote, "We should therefore be encouraged, moving up 10 places from 35th in the world to 25th this year. As a relatively new democracy compared to those more entrenched traditions of constitutionalism, we should be proud of our promotion of a free and independent media." Now, I often have a problem with some of these ranking things. I think they're not always great. And it's not just the media freedom one, also sometimes the democracy ones and stuff. I think there's like an imbalance in expertise in rating these countries, and so often you can see countries placed in weird places. But the overall point that South Africa has a pretty free media, I think, stands, and it is something that we should be proud of. But I guess the question, let me start with you, Michael, again, is firstly, do you think that there are significant threats to our media at the moment? We've seen in the past government wanted to sort of centralize. I think they had a media tribunal that they wanted to control the media with, and we've seen increasing murders of whistleblowers and political assassinations and that kind of stuff. Do you think we might be on the verge of greater threats to our media freedom? What's your take on the media space in general?
I think invariably, where a powerful government or any source of power is under threat or has been around for a long time and is perhaps looking at the end of its life, inevitably it's the message bearers who are going to be the first to be punished for things that go wrong, or be perceived as contributing to the decline and the loss of influence or the loss of public faith and so on. I think the heartening thing about this, and of course there's no thanks to Ramaphosa and the ANC, but the heartening thing about the rating of South Africa's media is that it's really a reflection, I think, of how the media behaves rather than of endowments that are, space allowed to the media or permission given to the media to do its job. It's really about the media insisting that this is its job and exercising those rights. It's in places it's a bit patchy. We all know how the past 20 years have very markedly altered the whole media landscape. There's less investment in the media because it's a very expensive industry, but also one in which it's quite hard to make a profit these days. So there are all sorts of pressures on the media, which do mean that sometimes you get juniorization leading to, feeble-minded coverage of things and poor analysis. And
that's a very good phrase. I like that phrase. Feeble-minded coverage.
Yeah. It's simplistic or lacking nuance, lacking understanding, basically lacking a sort of intelligent skepticism, which is really one of the hallmarks of very good journalism. So there are those things, but I think we do seem to have a good tradition of people. It really comes from the public, I think. People wanting to know, saying, we as citizens, we want to know what's going on. And of course, social media and the internet generally is a very powerful force here. Whatever criticisms one might have, or qualms one might have about the internet and so on, and it came well after my sort of journalistic career had more or less come to an end. But I see it as a very powerful and potentially hopeful or positive force in enabling ordinary people to say, I want to know, or this is what I've seen, or participating actually in bringing light to bear to all corners of society, which is really this sort of classic media function. So yeah, I think all around a positive thing, but always to be vigilant of and about, because there are those who will want to blame the media for their failures and therefore curtail the media and stop that probing torchlight.
So, Marius, and we can also come back to Michael on this once you've given your answer, Marius. Firstly, just your general take on the South African mediascape now and how much media freedom we have. You mentioned that we were second on the African continent in a pre-show discussion in terms of media freedom. But while I think our media is very free, it does frustrate me a bit in that, especially the bigger voices do often, I find, kind of get caught in a bit of a lockstep with each other. And I think that has been very bad the country's political development in some ways. But just your thoughts on that, and your thoughts on the media space in general.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that's one thing we can say in South Africa. We've obviously got lots of very serious problems, but you can pretty much still say whatever you want. You can criticize the president pretty openly. You're not going to get thrown in jail, whatever the case is, which is different in lots of other countries. And just looking at this media freedom list, we're ahead of places like the UK, Australia, Austria, Belgium. So I think it's definitely a feather in our cap. But I think you're definitely right. I think there's kind of a lot of especially bigger organizations, kind of credulousness with what the government does. I think especially when it comes to something like the lockdowns, the reaction to the COVID pandemic, I think there was probably not as much criticism of the government as it could have been. I remember News 24 had an article where they called when President Ramaphosa announced the lockdowns, called him majestic for some reason. I'm still not sure what that was about. So I think there is, and I think lots of people in the media still can't imagine South Africa outside of the ANC universe. They still, the ANC is still the voice of the people, or whatever the case is. And I think that's why you get a lot of criticism of parties like the DA, which, I mean, of course, the DA can be criticized, but I think often a lot of the criticism the DA does receive is a bit unfair, especially compared to, how the ANC acts often. So I do think that's probably that's maybe a problem, as you say, with the bigger players. But I think that's maybe something, they are kind of the part of the establishment. And we know there's lots of alternative media sources. I mean, this show, other people who put out alternative ways of looking at what's happening in South Africa. So I think overall, as I say, I think South Africans can definitely be proud of the media landscape in South Africa. And it's definitely one thing I think we can pat ourselves on the back about. And, the ANC sometimes comes out with these ramblings, like talking about the media tribunal. I remember Jacob Zuma was president. I think Bladen Zamandi was talking about we should bring in a law where you can't insult the president. And that was quickly shot down. And I mean, for all the ANC's faults, they've never really been very serious about actually restricting the media. And I think that's something as South Africans we can be very proud of. And, it's one thing that I think has played a role in pushing back against a lot of stuff. I mean, I don't always agree with what the Daily Maverick's opinion section says, but I mean, they obviously got great investigative capacity, News 24 too. So I think those are definitely, I think it's something that we can definitely be proud of, and it's not something to be sniffed at. It's definitely something we need to also protect.
Michael, your final thoughts on this, on the idea that I'd suggested the media, particularly the bigger players, have been far too soft on the ANC?
Yeah, I think that's partly right. I think my sense of it is that it's changed, but I think where the problem seems to arise is that there has been this quite solid unanimity about the values that South Africans want to see playing out, and I think that tended to be the thing that perhaps contaminated the critical thinking that Samantha, one of our listeners, highlighted a moment ago. So I think people tended to, their default position was to say, well, we are agreed that we want to have this kind of society, and the ANC, would appear to be the inheritor of the kind of long historic struggle to bring it about, and so it appeared to impart a sort of imprimatur to the ANC. But I do think that has changed. I mean, I think if you look across, as Marius says, the kind of big players in the media, you see very critical voices and increasingly critical voices. So I think it's not a sort of fixed position, and I think that is a very good sign that there is this level of constant reassessment, which I think is a very valuable thing in those big media houses, and generally people who are senior editors and opinion editors and so on, who take their role very seriously, and keep their minds open, and do in fact change their minds, which is a really good thing. Yeah.
Well, all right, let's move on to our last story, and we're going overseas now to talk about the upcoming election in Turkey. Turkey is about to have a presidential election where the current incumbent Erdogan will face off against a guy who I'm going to struggle to pronounce his surname, but his first name is Kemal named after, I presume, Turkey's founding father, Mustafa Kemal. And this election is thought that it might be the most consequential one in Turkey for a very long time. The election is currently showing Erdogan polling behind his opponent. And there are a lot of things at stake here. Erdogan has become one of the most powerful people in Turkish politics, in Turkey's political history, since Mustafa Kemal sort of stepped back from ruling the country. His opponents say that he has desecularized Turkey, which famously was quite aggressively secular in its approach when it was founded, that he has eroded rights in general, brought the judicial system entirely under his control, and has gotten Turkey involved in a number of geopolitical disputes which have isolated it from its NATO allies in the West, particularly the United States. At the same time, the opposition is also unhappy with his domestic policies. He's been very keen on low interest rates, which has seen inflation absolutely skyrocket in Turkey. I think they've averaged more than 50% inflation for the past 4 or 5 years. I think notoriously Erdogan put his son-in-law in charge of the Reserve Bank, which is never really a good idea. Also, he has gotten Turkey very involved in the Syrian civil war, where he has backed the rebels in the Syrian civil war and allowed something in the vicinity of 3 million Syrian refugees into Turkey. And this has become a very unpopular feature of his policy, which is possibly driving his low polling right now. And it's possible that that if the opposition wins, they may expel these people back into Syria, which could cause all sorts of things across the Middle East and maybe even in Europe. Marius, let's start with you. What do you make of all this? Erdogan's been accused of being a dictator. So, is it clear that he's going to relinquish power? What's your thoughts on all this?
Well, from what I've been reading, it seems that most people do think if he lost, he would relinquish power, but he has been putting people in jail. I mean, lots of institutions have been hollowed out in Turkey. I mean, not unlike what's happened in South Africa. But when he came to power, he did a pretty good job. He actually, incomes rose in Turkey. The GDP grew quite quickly, but then I think power went to his head. I mean, it's the famous quote of power corrupts and total power corrupts totally. Maybe that's what's happened to Erdogan. And there seems to be it's kind of a culture war in Turkey as well, between kind of more secular, more educated people versus people, more want to follow more traditional Islamic values and things like the headscarf. So before, people weren't allowed, if you worked for the government, you weren't allowed to wear headscarf, for example. And I think they were actually even banned at universities, and Erdogan changed all that kind of thing. But there's a nice line here from The Economist that I was reading, an article about the upcoming election. It says, Erdogan characterizes the election as a contest between proudly pious and nationalist Turks and a rabble of whiskey-sipping, godless elitists, Kurdish separatists, and sexual deviants, all slavishly seeking to embrace imported Western values. So I'm sure there'll be a lot of that kind of rhetoric. But yeah, it does seem that Erdogan's in trouble. And Turkey is an important country, depending on how you measure it. It's probably got the 11th biggest economy in the world. It's got about 70 million people. And, it's one of the few countries where it's a Muslim majority and where it's pretty democratic, and you can, there's pretty much freedom of speech and all that kind of thing, which Erdogan has been pushing back against. So I think it's an important election to watch. And I think it's also something for South Africans to watch. I mean, Erdogan's been basically in charge for about 20 years and seemed unstoppable. But things can change quickly, and I think it's similar to the situation with the ANC and kind of this moonshot pact or the wild dog parties that we've spoken about often here. If people can come together behind one, if the opposition can kind of unite, we could be seeing Turkey or Erdogan getting voted out. And I think that has what happened. Lots of opposition parties have decided to support one presidential candidate. And this is the guy that's polling at about 55% at the moment. So it's a very interesting election. And I think it's being held on Sunday, I think. So definitely something to watch out for.
On May 14th. Turkey's always had this autocratic sort of streak running through its politics. I think it's got this law where you can get in trouble with the law for insulting Turkishness, and it's like a very vaguely written law, which even the opposition doesn't look like it's going to change. But one of the things promised by the opposition is that they will decentralize power out of the presidency, where Erdogan has concentrated a lot of it. Michael, your thoughts on this upcoming election?
Your last point about that sort of streak of authoritarianism reminds me of, novelists. Orhan Pamuk, a very fine Turkish novelist, he fell foul of that edict or whatever it is. That he was accused of being anti-Turkish or bringing Turkey into disrepute. But as Marius says, I think it's very encouraging that you have a powerful figure, emerging leader of the secularist Republican People's Party coming up with the backing, according to this story, of an alliance of 6 opposition parties. So they clearly have decided that things are really so important that they must now work together. A good lesson for South Africa. Erdogan is modern Turkey's longest serving leader. So, again, as Marius says, we will have to see, indicate that things do change quite dramatically when people might think that the pattern is set. And I think it also shows that, in the modern age, it's very difficult to deny people the freedoms, the ordinary freedoms that they want. And eventually they just get tired of it and they say enough's enough, and they make a change. So we'll have to see on Sunday as to whether that's the case in Turkey.
So just on that insulting Turkishness thing, that's Article 301 of the Turkish Penal Code, and I think it's been in place since the 20s. And it makes it illegal to, and this is another thing I think as South Africans we can be grateful for, is that we don't have things like this. It is illegal to insult Turkey, the Turkish nation, Turkish government institutions, or Turkish national heroes. Sorry, it's been in place since 2005, but it's got origins back to the 20s. Anyway, with that in mind, I think that's all the time we have for the show today. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening. We hope that you found it interesting, and we will be back tomorrow on the Daily Preacher. Cheers, everyone.